Good afternoon. What is your name?
My name is Chris Elliott. I was a reporter on the Sunday Telegraph.
What is your connection to the Brixton Uprising?
I was a relatively young reporter on the Sunday Telegraph. It was my first job in Fleet Street. And I was sent, as the riot progressed, as we called it then, we don't call it now, we were sent, I think, around during the beginning of the afternoon, and I was on the streets till about midnight.
What does the uprising mean to you?
It's really interesting. It was the biggest thing I'd ever been in my life. And it was strange to me because I was actually born in Brixton. Wynn Road, just about half a mile from here. I'd been gone a long time, and as I followed the progress of the people on the streets, I went past our flat because my grandfather was a bookie, and we lived above commercial photographers on the corner of Wynn Road and Brixton Road. And I saw my old flat in the flames of the fire, and at the same time I'm reporting on the Rising. And I've never forgotten it. I had a very good friend called Carol Dawson, who was brave enough to get in the car with, at that time, Michael Gross, and we've been talking about it since then. And they were brilliant to her, and it was a very good story. And I also lost a colleague, a man called David Hodge, who was a 29-year-old freelance photographer who was hit over the head that night and died a few days later. It was a really big thing for me in the 80s.
What was your perspective of the Brixton Uprising?
Ever since I was asked to be involved in this project, I've really thought about it a lot. I mean, I wrote about it for the Guardian, where I spent the last 20 odd years, about 10 years ago, because it stayed with me. And because of so many things that have changed in the last few years, particularly Black Lives Matter, which has made me question all sorts of attitudes and assumptions that even if you thought you were on the right side of things, it's really made me think about what it meant. And I think on that night, and you have to remember there's a very honest feeling of, there is an excitement in these things. It's scary. It's like I knew a friend of mine who couldn't go to a football match because he would always be drawn to the trouble because it so excited him. So there's all that raw stuff there. And I think at the time we concentrated on what we then called the rioting and the looting. But in fact, we didn't think, as we should have done, about the anger. We didn't understand that since the 81 uprising, not that much had changed. I don't think we got, and even people like me who, kidded themselves that they knew more, we were, of course we were against racism, of course we believed this. We didn't really know, and we didn't really understand, and we didn't understand the anger. Because I do remember, and sorry for this being a long answer, but I do remember as we walked down Brixton High Street, I saw a group of people take a grill off the front of a shop with their bare hands. And I saw this reinforced grill move back and forth. And then it came off the wall, and it was purely human beings able to do that. And what we didn't do was think about the anger that lay behind that. It wasn't just that they wanted to, I can't remember if it was a jewellery shop or what it was in there. But no, that's what I think now.
How do you think that people during the riots saw you as like a journalist?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, it wasn't just David David Hodge, the photographer, had a thin skull. And he wasn't he didn't have the kind of news street sense. So he was standing right in front of a bunch of rioters with lots of expensive camera gear around his neck, because he was normally a science photographer. But there were people who were quite smart who got badly injured. I knew one Sunday Mirror reporter who got a machete across the face. Unfortunately, all my life I've looked like a policeman, especially when I'm wearing a suit and tie. And so on the streets that night, I did feel that I had to be very careful and be careful around side roads, because I didn't think people were going to say, don't worry, he's a really good bloke. He is a reporter. I think we were just seen as part of these people who had been oppressing them all these years, is what I think now.
Looking back, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh, don't think because you believe that you're against this or against that. Be open, be willing to listen, even if something surprises you. So for instance, the way in which language has changed. When your teacher, or one of your teachers, Dan Townsend, contacted me, he contacted me on Twitter, and he talked immediately about the Brixton Uprising. And I started, because the language we used then, we called it a riot, and writers, and as I say, even up to 10 years ago. But I thought, no, this is interesting, I must find out more about that. And now I will be much more natural about calling it a rising and uprising. And I think I would have liked to say, look, you may think you're a good bloke, Chris, but you're not necessarily. You need to listen more and be open to having some of those assumptions challenged. And realise that your experience of life is not everybody else's.
Did the uprisings change your life?
It changed my life in that it taught me about what vast numbers of people on the streets can do, what happens or can happen. It didn't change it. I didn't decide not to be a reporter anymore. I carried on being a reporter. But it did teach me a lot about those sort of circumstances.
After the Brixton Uprisings, did your perceptions change of what happened?
Yeah, I think now, but do you know what? I'm ashamed to say probably only in the last 5 to 10 years. The Black Lives Matter stuff really made me begin to think about, what I'd done, where I'd been, did I do this, what was I thinking when I did that? But Brixton was part of that, and that was partly why I wrote the piece in 2011 in The Guardian, because it stayed with me so strongly.
During the Brixton Uprisings, did you feel overwhelmed when you was reporting?
That's a really good question. Yes, I think I did. I think I felt wired. And when I saw the flat that I used to live in, I thought, I don't believe this. There was some burning cars. I couldn't believe it. I felt overwhelmed. The strange thing is I'm not very brave. So whenever I used to go to cover a riot or something dangerous, I was always terrified on the way in, and I wondered why I was doing it. What's scary about it was that when you get on the ground and you're moving around, and it's a very strange thing. It is like a group of bees or wasps or starlings. The crowd moves that way, you move with the crowd, police move that way, because I did Trafalgar Square, I covered riots in Northern Ireland. Some of that fear goes away. It becomes it mixes in with the excitement and of just trying to keep your head. So yeah, I did feel a bit overwhelmed. And at that time, I knew the bare bones of what had happened, was that in a raid on a house in Normandy Road, Cherry Gross had been shot by a policeman, and the person they were looking for wasn't even in the house. And I knew that, and I knew nearly everyone covering that knew that was wrong. But when you're on the ground, you get caught up in it.
How did you feel the police handled the uprisings?
My memory is that they were pretty shocked. They weren't prepared for the strength of feeling. It was only later on. I mean, I haven't looked back to how many arrests, how many injuries, or anything like that. So I may be wrong, but I felt at the time, it didn't feel to me like the police were really in control. But later, I might be wrong. One of the biggest problems is you're this one person at one vantage point. And I found this subsequently in really major events, major crowd events. You think the reason for something happening is this, because you've seen it. But if all sorts of other people at other parts of a building or in a crowd say, no, didn't you notice this? So from my perspective, I felt the police weren't that much in control. It seemed more like a stalemate. The crowd was so powerfully moved that I think the police were a bit taken aback.
During the uprisings, do you think reporters and newspapers were ever biased?
Yes, yeah, you have to say that. I mean, it's quite complicated. I mean, there were a lot of decent journalists out on the streets that night, and one of them was killed. So, and some of them were very badly hurt. But in general terms, the journalists, they had the assumptions, they had a feeling about, look, this is a riot, okay? These are people looting. And it's utterly wrong that Cherry Gross was shot and disabled. But, in quotes, a lot of the journalists, especially from a particular section of the press, thought there's no excuse for this. And it was written up really heavily, biased against journalists. At that time, there was not much effort, apart from some newspapers, like, I would say The Guardian because it's my old paper, but there was some quite straight reporting. I mean, if you look at the archives of the Daily Telegraph, believe it or not, in the 80s, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, the Daily Telegraph, the news reporting was much straighter. If you wanted the right-wing political stuff, you would look at what we call the leader page, the comment pages. But the reporters were meant to go out and report what happened. But of course, they brought their own assumptions. They brought their own prejudices. And the experience of the people who lived in Brixton at that time from the African Caribbean community and elsewhere wasn't their experience. So they would have a set of prejudices, even if they didn't think they had them. And it was hard because a lot of people were hurt. And you're not going to like someone who hurts your colleagues. So, but was there bias? Yes.